Humaneity, and I'm making a behind the scenes series of my podcast show so you can see what it's like to make podcasts while living and working on a sailboat. In this episode I wanted to talk about what it's like to be a guest, or how to be a great guest on a podcast. How to be a great guest on a podcast, yes. Well, this week I'm coming up to completing my 200th episode of doing podcasts. And as a result of all that, I've had a lot of time to talk to a lot of people across the world and to gauge what I think is an outstanding guest. And I just wanted to share that today because I think it might be useful, because a lot of people are doing podcasts, a lot of people are getting on podcasts as guests, and it really makes a big difference to the quality of the show depending on how the guest is on the show. So I just wanted to share some of those tips with you all today. So let's get into them. And the first tip is preparation. So preparing as a guest, what can you do? Well, let's go through the list. So what do you prepare as a guest? Well, you've got to do your homework, and I think the best way of doing your homework is to check out the podcast show that you're actually going to be on. So have a listen to a few episodes, get an understanding of the style of the guest that the host has on the show, and get an understanding of the style of the actual host, so you can understand what kind of feel and tone the show's going to be. It makes you more relaxed and prepared. So if you're a person that gets nervous with public speaking or talking on podcasts, then it helps to calm the nerves a little bit by understanding what kind of direction and what kind of tone the host actually has. So also from a preparation point of view, make sure that the host of the show has a lot of information about you. And this can be done in a variety of ways. I work now with a number of agencies across the world, and they filter my guests for me. And they have standard templates which are really, really good. And they help me no end because they provide all the necessary information that I need about the guest. So that includes things like their latest book that they might have written, lots of images, high quality images that I can use for promotional purposes of the show, a good lengthy bio, a short bio, and a medium length bio, so I can take bits and pieces and use that for different postings that I want to do, and also a good background about the guests themselves. So by the time I come to do the show, I've got a really good understanding. I have even read some of the books of the guests that I've had on the show, and it just helps me to prepare a lot more for the show. So provide the host of the show as much information as you possibly can. I would say that too much is never enough, and the hosts can then take what they need to prepare themselves for the show. So you've done your preparation work, then the next stage is to make sure that you have the right equipment. And this is a really big bugbear of mine, because I've had people with some of the worst microphone audio qualities that you could ever possibly imagine. And I've had very few that have had actually exceptional, what I call exceptional audio quality. And just think about it for a minute, because when a musician produces music, they like to use the best equipment and the best recording that they can to get the best song that they can. And you don't go on to Spotify and all these others and hear terrible music production, do you? So the same goes with podcasts, and the podcast industry really prides itself on the quality of audio output. So it takes a certain level of audio quality to make a great podcast show. And if you've been invited to be on someone's show who's putting in hours and hours of work to produce a show for you, because let's face it, they're telling your story to the world. So in a lot of cases, they're doing you a great favor. And the least you can do, I think, is to prepare for the show properly from a preparation point of view, but also from having the right technical equipment. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars, and this is a kind of a myth about the industry. There's lots of good equipment out there that you can buy. I'm going to put some links in the show notes of this particular video for you, so you can see some of the good equipment that I think is really good for a small budget. And just a disclosure, I'm not getting any payments by any of these organizations that I'm posting equipment for. It's just purely what I've tried and tested, so therefore I can recommend that they are good. So make sure that you do make the investment, because if you're going to be good on one podcast, chances are that you're going to get invited onto other podcast shows as well. And I've had people come on my show and they've ended up being on 10 other podcast shows. So it's worth the investment, and because of the world we live in today, with so much more being done online, you're going to get good use out of that equipment. Now, a lot of people say, well, I'm in lockdown and I can't get the equipment at the moment. Well, there's always ways and means, and you'll find that there's a lot of companies out there at the moment that will make home deliveries of your equipment because they want sales to be made. Now's the time to get not only good priced equipment, but to get it delivered to your home as well. So make sure you get really good equipment that's going to give the best production value for you and for the show host. Okay, what do we do next? Well, it's time for the show. So how do you actually prepare to be a guest on a podcast show? Let's talk about that. So now it's time to do the show, and what's the best way to prepare to be actually on the show? Well, there's a lot of things that people do. Some people meditate before they do a show, some people have a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, some people go for a run, some people just relax. You've got your own process on how to get yourself prepared to be the best. Best thing is, don't get straight out of bed and do a show. Don't come to a show super stressed from work. Make sure that you know what the show time is, therefore you can spend the 30 minutes or so before the show getting absolutely prepared for the show. Again, it's to do yourself justice for the show and also to put on the best possible quality for the host of the show. Now, there's a lot of techniques to do while you're actually on the show, and this is where I think a lot of guests fall short. So maybe some of these tips will be helpful for you. When you're on the show, make sure you listen to the questions that you're being asked. I have a particular question at the moment that I'm doing on one of my shows, the business show, and every single guest is not answering the question as I asked it. And it's a very easy thing to do, because when we're on a podcast show as a guest, we tend to be already thinking about things that we're going to say instead of listening to what's actually being asked of us. And if nothing else, the podcasting journey has taught me so far is to be a better listener and to listen to what my guests are saying. So when you've got a host that's really focused on listening, then he's going to be asking, or she's going to be asking you questions in relation to what you're talking about. So be specific and also be quite short and succinct. I've had a lot of guests who just love talking and they'll answer a question in about 5 or 6 minutes. That's way too long to answer a question. Try to use the 60-second rule. And I use that rule to say, right, if I'm talking more than 60 seconds, it's too long. So regardless of the question that I get asked, try to answer it within 60 seconds or less. The shorter the answers, the better, unless it needs a lot of explanation. That allows the host then to really make a flow of the podcast show and to get a conversation going, because a good podcast show, I believe, is not actually an interview situation. It's more of a conversation that's happening between the host and the guest. So imagine that you, and I say this to my guests all the time, I say to them before the show, just imagine that you and I are sitting down at a cafe and we're going to have a chat over a cup of coffee about the subject that we're talking about today. It can be travel, it can be business, or it can be a conversation. And that's really how I approach my show. So as a guest, if you go onto a show with a mindset of just having a conversation with the host, there's nothing wrong with you asking the host a question back. It's not all about them asking you all the time to make a good conversation. So think about the 60-second rule. Think about if you start waffling on too long, then it is too long and it doesn't allow the host to keep the flow of the podcast going. Make sure you speak into your microphone. A lot of guests don't do this for all of the show. So I know that if you're doing a 45-minute show or longer, it's difficult to concentrate. But the more that you can speak into the microphone, the better quality the audio is going to be, and less off-putting it's going to be also for the listeners. So think about it yourself. If you've been listening to a lot of podcasts, there's nothing more irritating than listening to a guest who waffles on too long, who doesn't talk into the microphone and it makes the sound go all over the place. Or the third thing, which is moving around and making noises. So they can be playing with something on their desk, they can be moving a chair on a wooden floor, they can be even checking their mobile phones, which is utterly rude and shouldn't be done. So make sure you don't fall into those easy traps where you're distracted by other things that are around. If you haven't done a podcast show before, practice doing it with somebody. Get on a Skype call with someone before you do the show and practice sitting there for 45 minutes having a conversation, not being distracted and focusing on the questions that are being asked for you. There's nothing like practicing anything in this world to be good at it. So as far as the tips go for being actually on the show, make sure that you are present in your mind, you're present in your body, and you're present in your soul. And what I mean by all those things is that you feel part of the podcast show. And of course the host's job is to make you feel part of that show. But from my experience, if you get a guest into the rhythm and into the mode of the show and they start to feel relaxed and comfortable, the sooner that happens, the better the show's going to be. So you play your role in making the conversation flow, and it'll be a great show for everybody. Now, a lot of guests think that after they've had their little talk session and they've shared with the world their big amazing story, that's it. That's the end of it. Well, it's not. That's actually when the work begins, because there's no point you doing a podcast show with someone if no one's going to listen to it. And someone told me a long time ago that you can make as many podcasts as you want, but if no one's listening to it, what's the point? I have a slightly different attitude. I just love making podcasts. So if one person listens to my podcast, I'm happy. But the fact is that a lot more than one person listens to my podcast show, and I would like to get your story as a guest on my show out to as many people as I possibly can. So after the show, there is a very important part that you play as a guest in getting the episode out to as many people as possible. And one of the things that I do before the show is I ask my guests to name 5 things they're going to commit to help to publicize the show. And obviously the one is social media and getting out on social media, but a lot of people don't listen to social media. A lot of people don't listen to podcasts by way of social media. So one of the most effective ways to get a podcast out there is through word of mouth. So talking to people, telling people that you've been on a podcast show, that is the most effective way of podcast distribution. The second way is to send out an email to your network to say, hey, I was on this podcast show. Here's the link to the show. Have a listen to it and tell me what you think. Asking your audience to give you feedback is very important, because then you'll find out, A, that they've actually listened to it, and B, most people will tell you honestly what they think about your podcast experience. And it's something very much for you to be proud of as well. So emailing it out to your world, to your network, is a very good thing to do. So remember to do that. And what I do in my show is I actually get my team to prepare some graphics for my guests so they don't have to do any work at all. After the show, the graphics are sent to them by email, and then they can send out those graphics with the link to the show and say, here, have a listen to my podcast show. So there you go. There's some more tips about how to get the show promoted so that your experience can get some feedback. And when we've got feedback, as I have on every one of my shows, it helps me as a host to be better at what I do. It also helps you as a guest to be better in what you're doing as well if you're going to go on to another podcast show. So there we go. What happens next? Well, based on your success of the podcast show, is to go over and get on another show. Yes, go and be a podcast guest again, and like I do with every show that I host, try and become a better guest. Try and improve every time that you do a show. And all those categories that I've just mentioned to you in this video, whether it be preparation before the show, the equipment, during the show and your behavior, or after the show, write down on a piece of paper or on your notebook or whatever how your performance was for that particular show and whether you feel as though you improved or not. And I can tell you what, if you're the type of person that does these things, you're going to get invited onto a lot of podcast shows. I've got my list of favorites that I've written down on my show that I've had as guests, and I'd love to have them back as many times as I possibly can to be on my show, because they're energized, they prepare properly, they engage properly on the show, and they do their work afterwards to help promote the show. So if you're going to be somebody that wants to be on a lot of podcast show, whether it be for your business, for a book launch, or for a project that you're working on, those are the things that I think that are going to help you become a better podcast guest. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed this little video of me sharing what I think are the fundamental important things to be a great podcast guest. I'm going to go back to the boat now and do some preparation for my next show. There we are, beautiful day. Hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching my videos. Don't forget to subscribe, make a comment, leave a like, do whatever you like on the button, and I'll see you again soon in another behind the scenes video from the boat. See you all, have a great day.